Hi, my name is Grant Kramer, and I'm a professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. Today, I will talk to you about vineyard maintenance. Now, you might ask, what does this photo have to do with vineyard maintenance? Well, it's a place that's very unusual with a very different set of vineyard maintenance requirements. This is the island of Santorini that I visited to look at some grapes that were growing there that were very drought and salt tolerant as well as heat tolerant. A set of grapes that I thought might do well in the Las Vegas or Southern Nevada area. So let's look at a few pictures before we get into our Northern Nevada vineyard maintenance. One of the nicest wineries on the island of Santorini is the estate Aguirros. And I had a very nice tour there with a very well-known viticulturalist. We went to visit some of the vineyards there, and you can see here the vineyard. Yes, those are grapes growing there, very, very low to the ground. The purpose of that is to avoid the high winds and protect the grapes, but also they have very little moisture on this island, and the grapes are actually collecting moist air from the sea to help them grow. This is what the trunk looks like. So this is a very interesting training process in which they're wrapping the vine shoots into a circle. And yes, you can grow very nice grapes. These are Assyrtiko grapes, one of the nicest white wines you will ever taste, grown in a hot climate, and it's unique to this island of Santorini, grown there for at least 2,000 years. Okay, let's move forward to vineyard maintenance. So today I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but briefly talk about the things you're going to need to do in a vineyard over the course of the season. So for weed control, principles are to use mechanical methods such as disking from a tractor or just simply a hoe by hand. And if you catch your weeds very early, then you can control them very easily. Some people use pre-emergent herbicides to prevent the seeds from germinating, and other people use ground cover to control the competition with weeds. In our environment where water is very precious, it's still debatable whether or not ground covers are a useful method because they compete with the water. Chemicals that I've used have been Roundup or glyphosates, but you have to be very, very careful with it. You have to spray in conditions where the no drift can occur. If you get any on it, it's a systemic herbicide. Get anything on a leaf, I just rip the leaf off immediately so it can't get transported to the rest of the plant. But it is very effective at controlling weeds. You need to be diligent and work on those weeds on a weekly basis and stay on top of them. They're much, much easier to control and take care of if they're very little and they haven't gone to seed yet. Once they've gone to seed, you've just compounded your problem. Herbicides can become a problem if you don't spray the right ones and you don't spray them in the right location. We had a very severe vineyard issue where we had an employee spray Dicamba, which is not a herbicide that is recommended for growing on grapes. It's used for woody plants, and it's in fact very, very poisonous to grapevines. And on top of that, the person sprayed too much Dicamba, about 3 times the recommended dose for normal weeds. The vines were almost killed. We flood irrigated the field to try to reduce the damage to the vines. As you can see in this photo, the vines are still quite stunted after 5 years of exposure to Dicamba. Now, Dicamba is supposed to disappear from the soil in about 3 months, but clearly that was not the case with our vines and continues to plague them 5 years later. So grapevines are very, very sensitive to this auxin-based herbicide. Auxin is a plant hormone. With too much of it, it causes these types of effects. 2,4-D is another auxin-like herbicide that you use on your lawns to kill your dicot weeds in your grass. Another practice, as a general maintenance practice, is leaf pull. We've already talked about this in another video, so I'm going to pass over this, but basically you want to do this immediately after berry set to minimize any kind of sunburn on the fruit. We remove leaves surrounding the cluster. You also want to remove shoots that are growing out of the bottom of the cordon. You want to train those shoots upwards through the trellis wires throughout the season. And you want to remove excess shoots from the spurs or anywhere else, or even lateral shoots that are growing on the existing shoots to provide an open canopy with more balanced pruning. Cluster thinning is another potential task during the season. So cluster thinning is the removal of nascent clusters after bloom to maintain the proper leaf area to fruit ratio. So if you have too much fruit, you're going to have to remove some of that fruit. Cluster thinning after bloom increases the fruit quality and provides more uniformity during ripening. Depending on the vine size, the optimal cluster count after thinning should be about 32 clusters per vine in our Reno conditions. Secondary clusters may appear as the season progresses, and these should be removed as well. Here's the impact that you can see on a study that was done on cluster thinning and the timing on cluster weight. And the earlier that you do your thinning, the larger your cluster weight will be. Pretty much on a weekly basis, you want to walk through your vineyard if you're using a vertical shoot positioning system and train your vines up to grow upright between the wires. Okay, back to our vineyard maintenance. We've covered weeding, vine maintenance, pathogen control. I've already made a video about powdery mildew. It's really the only serious disease that we have at this point in Nevada, but there are the emergence of other diseases likely to occur, one of which are the trunk diseases, which I'll talk a little bit about here in this video. And then I will talk about pest control. And we don't have too many pests, but we do have a few. Our dry conditions just really prevent a lot of disease and prevent a lot of insect problems. But we do have other problems. We can have problems with root knot nematode. Phylloxera has not hit us yet, but could. I've actually seen white flies in the vineyard here, not our vineyard, but in someone else's. I have no clue as to how that happened, but I'll talk about that briefly. We have lots of rabbits and deer in the area, but our most prevalent pest are birds during the harvest period when the grapes are starting to ripen. Those birds can go crazy over those sweet grapes. And we'll talk about that briefly here. Okay, trunk diseases. This last spring, I was working in a vineyard where these symptoms suddenly appeared in the vineyard. The vines were looking very, very good. And then there was this browning dieback of the shoots that were growing. Within a little period of time, these shoots started to grow again. They're isolated in particular locations along the cordon. On some vines, they may be all across the cordon, and others, they may be just one little patch or two. Back here, you can see some dwarf shoots that are just not growing very well. These are signs or symptoms of trunk disease. And trunk diseases are a set of different bacteria that attack the trunk. And they're largely spread through pruning, especially during the rainy season, where you have bacteria on your pruning shears because you've cut into an infected vine. Then you transfer that to the next vine when you prune that vine with those pruning shears. There are several different diseases. I'm not going to go into them and the bacteria that are involved in them, but you can read about them down here in this PDF file that I've linked on the web here. I highly recommend reading it. It's a prevalent disease, but it develops slowly in the vineyard, and we did not have that at our UNR vineyard, but it does occur in this area. Root knot nematodes. Nematodes are parasitic little worms. They're very, very tiny, almost microscopic, and they attack the roots and suck the sap of the roots, reducing the vigor and the yield in the vines. In addition, these nematodes can transmit grape fanleaf virus, which then has a significant impact on the growth of your vines. They penetrate into the roots, and then they can induce giant cell formation, which usually results in the formation of root galls. So here's some symptomology of the nematodes. You often will see a lack of vigor in the vineyard in areas where the nematodes are attacking, with restricted growth and reduced yields. That's one symptom, but that could be a symptom for many other things as well. The root knot nematodes produce small galls on the roots, but they can be larger when multiple infections cause galls to coalesce. The virus transmission by the dagger nematode produces symptoms on the leaves, such as yellowing of the veins. On the left here, you can see a nodule on a root tip. If you were to dig up a root, this is maybe what it would look like. Nematode control is not simple or easy. Clearly, one way of preventing it is not having it in the soil to begin with. So you do soil tests, and you can treat the soil before you plant your vineyard. Soil solarization, or heating up of the soil, could kill them. It used to be that sprays were used, like methyl bromide, but those are no longer allowed as they're very poisonous. So the best defense, in fact, is having a rootstock on your vine that will be resistant to those nematodes. And Andy Walker at UC Davis's breeding program recently has released some rootstock that is very resistant to nematodes. So if you have that problem, that might be an option. Phylloxera. Historically, phylloxera has been the most devastating grape pest ever known in the modern world. It turns out that this is a pest from North America, and therefore the North American species are very resistant because they've co-evolved with this pest. Phylloxera is sometimes referred to as a louse, but in fact, it's an aphid, and it has a life cycle that is largely in the ground, and it feeds on the roots, so you don't see it. But at times, it gets into a wing form and lays eggs on a leaf, causing these pustules, as you see here on the left. The longest part of the life cycle is actually in the ground. And so most of the time you will not see the symptoms of phylloxera, you'll just see reduced growth. So the solution to phylloxera is using phylloxera-resistant rootstock again to protect against it. At this point in time, I do not know of us having phylloxera in the state of Nevada, but it's just a matter of time before we will get it. At this point in time, we haven't been recommending dieback from cold that occurs and is an issue. However, at some point in time, we will probably have to grow our grapes on phylloxera-resistant rootstock. Okay, I mentioned a little bit about whitefly. This is a picture of a vineyard of a local grower here in which he was growing Cabernet Sauvignon, and you can see all these white little spots all over the leaves, and that was caused by whiteflies. Now, whiteflies I've only seen in the greenhouse before this incident. There were whiteflies growing, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I had to get a photograph. So it's the only time I've ever seen it. I doubt it will be a problem for you. I'm not even sure how this person got whiteflies in their vineyard. Rodents and birds are a significant threat to your crop. When you're growing, it's just starting out your vines, of course, the rabbits are going to attack the trunk, so you may need to put some sort of protective collar around or wire around the grapevine trunk. Deer later on, if you have a lot of deer in the area, are going to come and eat your leaves. You may need to put a deer fence up, and that requires a special kind of fence. But the biggest problem and the biggest issue will be birds, and the biggest bird threat are starlings, because they can form very large flocks. And a very large flock has reduced our vineyard to nothing in about 30 minutes, completely wiping out our harvest. So the solution to that is to have bird netting and put that around your berries just before those birds want to start attacking the vines. And I found my experiences around 16% bricks or so, the birds start eyeing that fruit and start picking at it, and which is well before we want to harvest the grapes. They like the berries before we do. So there are a variety of things that you can do to try to protect against them. People have used all sorts of visual and auditory deterrents, such as mylar reflective tape or scary balloons or distress calls or sounds, but this might distress the birds for a brief moment, an hour or two, but they quickly adapt and they are largely ineffective as a deterrent for birds. Really, there's only one method, which is the netting. However, if you have hawks in the area, they do act as a very good deterrent, and you could try to provide locations or poles or posts for which they would build their nests in the area, and then that would help to reduce the pressure. Here is a photo of a starling. You can see on the right here a flock of starlings coming through the vineyard. And finally, I'll finish with this. Here is a whole set of starlings flying around in the Sonoma area, looking to land on a vineyard down below right there. Please like it on YouTube. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye.